I am so inspired. I just feel like going back and sitting down because all of the messages, the consistent messages of this evening about community, about hope, about liberation, about planting the seeds of opportunity are just tremendously inspiring. And I think to have an interfaith community gathered to talk about its work in a temple of education is especially profound, and it's an honor to be here. So thank you all for welcoming me. I have old friends here, I have new friends here, and it feels very much like a homecoming. So I want to have a conversation with you today. It's going to be a conversation aided and abetted by some slides. It's not a lecture, so please don't worry. I hope it's inspiring. And it was going to be called Building an Infrastructure of Opportunity in St. Paul, and that sounded rather tedious, especially after dinner. So the rabbi has spoken, and his text was profound. My text is less profound. It comes from 1970s television, ladies and gentlemen. And if any of you remember a famous sitcom called The Jeffersons, does anybody remember The Jeffersons? Who knows the theme song? Moving on up, moving on up. So that is my text. That is my text. Who's moving up in St. Paul? That is, ladies and gentlemen, our text for this evening. And I know there are two of my fellow graduates of the Yale Divinity School in here. Please don't write and have my degree rescinded. So what I want to do tonight is look with you at the current patterns of economic mobility in St. Paul and look at the levers that can be used to change what I think you will find to be unacceptable. Look at who in this city and this region is stuck with limited economic opportunity, who is in need of liberation, if you will. And look at how young people growing up in this city can gain access to the opportunities that are so abundant and so present in the lives of so many of us in this room. So we are in a community college, ladies and gentlemen, and you have a test. It is open book. Here's the question. How many of you believe that where a person starts out in life should not determine where they end up? Da, 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 da. Let me see. Da, 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 da. Where did you find these brilliant people? I think everybody raised their hand. When I did this last week in North Carolina, I didn't get 100%. A little disturbing, but this is what we mean by the American dream. It is that belief. It's a myth, but it's grounded in, I think, at least a sense of confidence that we all have within us the ability to get through hard work, some luck, favorable winds of circumstance to a better place. That's what we like to believe this country is about. But if you went out to the end of your driveway in July of 2013 and got the newspaper and opened it up, the New York Times, what you saw on the front page was this map. And this map, which is a visual depiction of data from the Equality of Opportunity Project, scholars at Harvard and Berkeley and now at Stanford, looked longitudinally at young people who were born in the early 1980s, where they ended up on the economic distribution by the time they were adults. And essentially what this says is, where the map is everything but olive or kind of light green, the chances of a child born to parents in the bottom 20% of the income distribution are more constrained than for any other group. In other words, the chance that a child born poor to parents who are poor to achieve the American dream are not universally present across the United States. we don't have a landscape of opportunity. We have a very mottled landscape when it comes to upward mobility. And if you look at Minnesota, it's kind of parts of it doing pretty well, parts of it not. The part of the country where I come from, the South, is all blood red. But the fact is, and we're going to look at what these data look like in a second for St. Paul, the idea that if I'm born to a family at the bottom of the economic distribution in the United States, I have a fair and equal proportional chance to get to a better place. That simply is not the case. This is another chart. My goal here is to get you very upset and then get you to feel better, and then we'll see what we can do about the things that got you upset. Let me kind of just put my pedagogy out there. This is another data set from the Pew Charitable Trust, a major national foundation, looking at a slightly different starting point, but the same thing. What are the chances across the United States, a national data set, for a child born to a family in the bottom 20% of the income distribution of being there as an adult? This really shocked me. Because what this says is, if I'm a child born at the bottom, this is a longitudinal data set, so let's assume those patterns continue to hold. That's what this would say. There's a 43% chance that as an adult, I myself will be in the bottom 20%. That just to me is absolutely galling. That is not America. Now, if there were a fair distribution, there'd be a 20% chance that I'd be in the bottom 20%. So this is more than double the chance that I'll be stuck at the bottom. So this idea of some kind of cement overshoes, this chronic generation on generation stickiness at the bottom, is a very real and palpable problem in America. And you think about what happened between the early 1980s and the early 2000s, that was a period of a fair amount of economic growth and expansion. If it stranded these people at the bottom, what does that say about how we're organized? Here's what the chances of moving up to the next quintile are. 50% would be a median income. So basically there's a 70% chance if I'm born at the bottom that I'm not even going to get to the midpoint in the income distribution as an adult. So if we take a look at who's moving up and not at St. Paul, this is Minneapolis-St. Paul. We couldn't disaggregate with this data set just St. Paul, but this is this metro area. And you'll see, let's look at the bottom on the far left. Here are the chances that a child born to the bottom will be at the bottom as an adult, and the chances that they'll move up one quintile. This is a 58% chance that someone will not even make it to the median. And if this were proportionally fair, that 58% would be 40%. So there's a dramatic over-representation of people at the bottom who are stuck at the bottom. This is profoundly serious. Now, were one lucky enough, to be born at the top, there's a very good chance that you will stay stuck at the top. That is chapter 2, and we're not going to go there today. But this is not a picture of mobility, of opportunity, of fairness, and I don't think is consistent with the American dream that we believe. So what keeps people stuck in place? The folks who did that equality of opportunity study came up with 5 factors. Who here has been to Africa on safari? Anybody? You know the big 5. These are the big 5. We put some animals down here at the bottom. It makes it easier. What keeps people stuck in place? Growing up in a neighborhood that is segregated by race, by occupation, or by income is closely correlated with a young person not moving up. And it sort of stands for a reason. If I particularly am in a neighborhood that's poor, or I don't see people going to work that may not have services or amenities, it's reasonable to see how that might be the case. Income inequality. If I live in a setting where there is a wide gap between the bottom and the top, if the rungs in the ladder are harder to climb up, it stands to reason getting to that next rung, the next, and ultimately the top is going to be a harder climb because the rungs will be farther apart. Does that kind of make sense for you? I did learn my economics, as Paige Coles will probably attest, from the back of the cereal box, so you have to excuse me. But this, I think I can explain the Big Five. Local school quality, and we're going to come back to this. There's a deep relationship between students being in schools that are characterized by high concentrations of student poverty. Those schools, unless heroic efforts are made to compensate for underinvestment, simply don't have the resources and often don't have the cultural reinforcement to light the aspirations and spur young people forward. Family structure. Here, this is not a political statement. It really speaks to the fact that in our economy, it takes most often two adults to sustain a family, two working adults. So if I'm in a family with one adult wage earner and dependent children, that effectively means I have an economic hand tied behind my back. And then finally, this intangible but powerful concept of social capital. How many of you know the work of Robert Putnam, who's written so beautifully about bridging social capital, the networks and relationships that link different people to each other? Imagine growing up in an isolated, residentially segregated neighborhood and think about how you would get information about a wider life or a better life or opportunity. It's very, very difficult. I translate social capital as experiential isolation. And I think too many of our young people are on the receiving end, if you will, or in situations that are saturated with experiential isolation. And how can you light the aspirations of somebody who has only seen but so far? I was in Cleveland a couple of weeks ago giving a version of this talk, and the head of their higher education compact owned a fleet of a network of car dealerships, and he said, you know, I'm in the car business. Why would somebody who'd never seen a car want a car? That's what I mean by aspirations. How can we aspire? How can a young person aspire to something they can't see or can't imagine? The Big Five, just so you can remember. So residential segregation is, by this map, dark purple or deeply segregated places. It's a national phenomenon. It's particularly pronounced in metropolitan areas. This is segregation by race, income, and occupation, meaning blue and white collar people living in different places. What the Martin Prosperity Institute tells us is that a major driver of residential segregation is, in fact, the behavior of affluent and privileged people to isolate themselves from folks who are not like them. That's really pretty profound. It's the self-segregation of people who might be able to provide some of the social capital that folks in isolation need. And here you see, it's a busy chart, but this is the percentage of the population under the poverty line living in high poverty neighborhoods from 1990 to 2013. And overall, and for white, black, and Latinos, you see that the rate was high in the 1990s, it dropped, and it's for all groups, it's beginning to move back up. So we're becoming, as a nation, more segregated. Here's a map. It's hard to see with these lights, but the blue dots are where white people live, the green where it looks sort of mustardy, where African Americans live, the red where Asians live. This is the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So you see not a dispersion, but a real concentration. And Minneapolis-St. Paul is far less segregated than the typical large metropolitan area. But even here, in a place that's doing fairly well on this dimension of the Big Five, there are challenges with how we live. Income inequality. This is the earned income growth for full-time wage and salary owners in real terms from 1980 to 2012. And you see here what we all know, it's fueling a lot of the toxic civic dialogue now, that the real gains in income dramatically have been since 1980 for people in the top quintile. If you had looked at this for the previous 30 years, these bars would have been absolutely reversed. The real income gains in the immediate post-war period went to people at the bottom of the income distribution. So this helps explain this kind of swinging of the seesaw that has left many of us wondering what's happening with opportunity. Now, inequality scares me. It's like icebergs. I don't quite know how to deal with it. So Robert Reich's statement, I think, is a helpful thing for those of us who are sitting there saying, so what can I do about it? And he said inequality would not be a problem, or would be less of a problem, if upward mobility were strong in America. If we didn't have these tectonic plates that were frozen in place, if people could get to a better place, there would be less of anxiety about the pulling apart. But in fact, we do have tectonic plates and ever-widening rungs, to use two metaphors, on the ladder. So we're feeling this challenge of inequality. Family structure, I mentioned that was one of the big five. The fact of how hard it is in a single head of household earning situation to sustain a family. Here in Minneapolis-St. Paul, this is pretty telling. These are the median earnings for a single adult wage earner with one dependent child. The median for all occupations in Minneapolis-St. Paul is 2014. Half the jobs provide enough sustenance for an adult with a dependent child. Half don't, according to the MIT Living Wage Project. But here's what it actually takes in terms of meeting basic expenses for a parent with one dependent child to meet expenses and have some amount of a financial cushion. So we really have, even in a place that is as prosperous as Minneapolis-St. Paul, a problem with too many jobs not paying enough for someone to be able to sustain themselves and a dependent child. Here is the chart that I think, when we looked at it, is most challenging, perhaps, for St. Paul. And these are the percent of students in St. Paul, not just public school, but all students, by poverty level in 2014. And where you see the orange, those are high poverty schools that are characterized by more than 75% of students being eligible for free and reduced priced lunch. And you see, not only is the number large, 56%, more than half, but look at the racial disparity here. This is pretty stunning. So while 17% of white students are in schools that are highly concentrated in poverty, 64% of Black and Latino, 79% of Asians, and I presume, given your welcoming of immigrants, this is probably driving much of that number. But these are particularly disturbing numbers. Gary Orfield, who is a brilliant education scholar at Stanford, made a wonderful point a couple of decades ago, and he said, when it comes to achievement, it matters far less that a black or a brown child sit next to a white child than that a poor child sit next to a middle-class child. So just take that as perhaps gospel, and look at what is the likelihood that a poor child is going to be seated next to a middle-class child when there are these kinds of factors of concentration. And finally, we won't elaborate this, but a number of writers, Bill Bishop, Jim Joseph, Robert Putnam, have talked about our clustering into smaller and smaller communities of meaning and memory, where people who are different from us are socially incomprehensible. And think about how that makes social trust that much harder to realize. So these are the big five. That's the bad news. You can it's done. Here's the good news, and I love this slide. We talked about mobility incomes needing to shift. How do mobility outcomes change with a post-secondary credential? Back to the Pew data, no post-secondary credential, a very high chance, 47%, that somebody at the bottom will be stuck there. But look what happens if that person gets a 4-year post-secondary credential. It drops to 10%. I don't know of anything as dramatic, and thank heaven we're in a place that's about putting young people on this path, that can talk about the liberating effect of a single action or strategy in getting someone unstuck at the bottom. Earning a post-secondary credential, this speaks to a 4-year credential. The numbers are equally strong, if not quite as dramatic, for a 2-year associate's degree. This is the ultimate lever for liberation for people who are born at the bottom. Sorry to go kind of fast. Here you see that, again, the rate at which different population groups in St. Paul actually have that post-secondary credential varies significantly by race. And if you think back about those schools and ask yourself then, given the situation of high poverty schools, who's on a path to get the liberating post-secondary credential? That really raises an important question for us. So if we're going to get people to the Holy Grail, I call this the yellow brick road, if they're going to get to Oz of a family supporting employment, they're going to need a post-secondary credential that can unlock that. Just like those culinary students we saw, they're on that path. So this has to happen. We've got to get students ready, thinking about prepared academically and aiming for college, just as many of you do who volunteer for, is it Project? Spirit. You're doing this work. You're doing the work of readiness, of preparation. Then getting people connected by taking the right exams, filling out the FAFSA, getting financial aid, entering an institution like this with a culture that is committed to this path of completion. That's really what the path of liberation looks like. But we've seen from the Big Five that the work of liberation, working down that virtuous path, means navigating a lot of forces. We talked about the Big Five, but race and ethnicity, transportation, how well the transportation lines run to where people need to go when classes are happening, and if I'm working 2 jobs, can I get to the community college? I mean, these complicated systems issues, cultural messages and representation. When I think about who goes to college, do I see myself in that picture, or do I see somebody who doesn't look like me? Does that kind of make sense? When I was a boy, my favorite picture from my childhood is of me at 3 years old. I'm in a little camel hair suit with shorts and long pants and a beanie, standing with my parents, and we're at the graduation ceremonies at Howard University. And my parents didn't know anybody who was graduating from Howard University that year, but it was a ritual in Washington, D.C., that African-American families took their children to graduation at the college because it was setting a cultural message that this is who you can, will, and must be when you are going to grow up. I have that picture still in my house. I like it. It's just a beautiful picture. But it's about trying to overcome the negative forces in the ecosystem that hold some of us back. So we're now going to do a little talk. I know we're running close on time, but a little story where you get to talk to each other. And I'm going to punctuate it with the story of Lillian and Norris. I want you to meet Lillian and Norris, a very attractive couple. Lillian and Norris were the first in their families to go to college. And they were both children of grandchildren of disadvantage. Lillian's grandfather was a slave in Virginia. He failed to escape twice. On the third escape, his mistress just said, "Stanton, you're big trouble. I'm just going to let you go." He went got on the Underground Railroad, went to Chatham, Ontario, became a farmer, had 9 children. Poor wife died young, we don't know why. His oldest daughter gave birth to several children, of whom Lillian was the one daughter. And Lillian benefited from the fact that after the Civil War, abolitionists created a number of higher education institutions, and one called Fisk University was established so that the descendants of former slaves like Lillian could get a post-secondary education. And this is her graduation picture from 1906. Norris' father was a free man of color, and they moved from Richmond to Washington, D.C. after the Civil War because it was more hospitable. And Norris was lucky because in Washington, leaders had come together to create, for the first time in America, a high school, a public high school to educate African American children. And because the faculty there were also college educated, but couldn't use their degrees many places in a Jim Crow society, they came back and taught in this exceptional school, Dunbar High School, which became a college, a factory to get people to go to college. Norris wanted to go to a really good school. And his advisor said, "Norris, you need a little more preparation. We have some contacts at a place called Phillips Exeter Academy." So in 1906, Norris got on the train and went to Phillips Exeter, and from there got into the University of Michigan, worked his way through by cooking on the train, on a hot plate, back and forth, meals, finished there, went to Detroit, where he found and fell in love with Lillian. And you may wonder why I know so much about these. These are my grandparents. Their middle son was my father. So I love those stories because there was a sense of aspiration, of what people call grit. But also, Lillian and Norris benefited from the foresighted, generous investments of people who believed in mobility for people not themselves. They created institutions by which others could rise. So here, I just want you to talk to your neighbor for a minute. And I want to ask you, who are your Norris and Lillian? What made mobility a possibility in your family? And what might have hindered it? Just talk for a minute. We're going to see what the narrative tells us about what we need to build and do today. Just take a few minutes. Okay, sorry. This is really what we should have done, is told mobility. I know, it always happens. It's always. But start a diary about your mobility story. Just start thinking about this. Some insights. What characterized the mobility stories that emerged from your short conversation? What fostered mobility? Education, families. What did families do?
Made sacrifices so that we could get education.
Made sacrifices. Maybe set aspirations, pointed the way forward. We have education, families. What else?
Perseverance and the GI Bill.
Yeah.
This group is brilliant. Where do these people come from? You know how long it normally takes for someone to mention anything to do with public policy? The GI sort of helps, doesn't it? What else?
Well, just to continue public policy, free excellent public higher ed institutions. So you could, go to school for almost nothing and become an engineer.
Yeah. So there's this importance of institutions, what we're going to come to see in a minute, this infrastructure of opportunity that is purpose-built to be able to help people move forward. It's really important. We sort of maybe kind of used to know what we were doing. Sorta, kinda, used to. Maybe. What else?
David, in this area, we have post-secondary education options, and it gives people after the 8th grade the opportunity to take courses right here for free. And while they're in high school, they can do it on the weekends and in the summertime, and they can literally graduate with an associate's degree that they've earned without costing them anything. And some of them can walk here to this neighborhood.
That's great. That's great. So options, first of all, many choices, many pathways. Pathways, as you're saying, tied to real opportunities to apply what is learned in a trade to earn an income. That's really, really important and accessible.
Yes, I think one thing that we need to acknowledge, at least amongst the people that I see, is that we all know that the United States was built on a foundation of race. So when we talk about a GI Bill, which was for white people, not for people of color, and when we talk about we have land, it was taken from Native American Indians, I mean, we can stall out a conversation here, but in terms of the foundation of what gave me and my ancestors mobility was fundamentally that they were white. And they were able then through hard work, perseverance, access to education, so in a sense get me to where I am today. But without that, no, I don't think the probabilities would be even close to something like that. And I would add one more thing that I wish we could really talk about. I found the most important thing that you said this evening is basically that those of us who have income and wealth segregate ourselves from those who don't. And you referenced, I forgot who it was that said that a lower income child, maybe a color, doesn't need a white kid, maybe a middle class kid.
Gary Orfield, yes.
Right, okay. But we ourselves move away. And we move away, and we move away. And at first it was white, and now it's just green. As long as you can earn that income, we move away. That paradigm, if we're going to actually fundamentally change the bottom 20%, has to change.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's exceedingly powerful. And I think you're right. Not all the policies put in place were intended to benefit all people. And my grandparents, whether by luck or being one of the talented 10th, were able to escape to a point where 90% of people who look like them couldn't. So you're absolutely right. So education's a liberation strategy. And what is it going to take to make that work? There's a wonderful phrase that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it produces. And I think the gentleman back there said, there was an intelligent design. It was cruel, it was biased, but it was intelligent. And it produced the results that we're now seeing replicated. And for these kinds of mobility challenges to exist at the scale, depth, and pervasiveness that they do, this isn't just the kind of aggregation of tiny individual actions. There's systems underneath the patterns that we see that need to be fundamentally re-engineered if we want to see different results at scale. Do you agree? I mean, this isn't, we have to say, what is it we want to accomplish, and what is the system that we need, or the ecosystem we need, with all of those cloud factors to allow people of all kinds, races, incomes, to progress along that yellow brick road. So, if we want new results, we're going to need to re-engineer our communities so that mobility is a reality for people on the margins, and particularly for people who are stuck generation on generation at the bottom. Because I would contend that our systems have never penetrated that deep to people at the bottom so that they aren't perpetually stuck there. We really have to do something we haven't ever really, in recent time at least, figured out how to do. So that's where we come to this notion of an infrastructure of opportunity. Randy alluded to it. MDC writes about it a lot. And the term is pretty basic. we talk a lot about physical infrastructure. And what happens when you walk into a dark room and turn on the light switch? What happens? The lights should come on. What happens if you walk into a room and turn on the spigot? What do you expect to happen? Water and clean, maybe. So we've got this notion of pervasive, reliable infrastructure that can deliver physical things from one place to another. We need an infrastructure of opportunity that can do the same for people to help them realize their aspirations. We think the infrastructure of opportunity includes things like this, and Randy has elaborated on these in some very powerful ways. In MDC's work, it begins with committing to a common vision that says we are going to change these patterns of stickiness so that everyone has a chance to move forward. Creating pathways for family-supporting work that allow more individuals to thrive. We're going to engage the whole system, because the only way you change the whole system is to engage people in thinking about how it can be made better. Large employers and institutions like this have weight and influence. But one of the things that Randy is pointing out so beautifully is individuals and congregations also have weight and influence. And so I would amend this today to say encourage institutions and collections of individuals working through their institutions to begin to create a table where a new design can take place. We've got to assume that potential lies in everyone, just as we saw in that beautiful video, people from all stripes of enormous talent finding a place to deploy it, to hone it and deploy it in this institution. Reallocate resources so that they are focused, I would say intentionally, on lifting up and supporting people in the bottom 20%. And I think the good news is, where we've studied communities that have done this, often the social venture capital to begin to break the ice on innovation has come from philanthropy. I think it can also come from people of faith working together. So there's a leadership opportunity, I think, for those of us who might not see ourselves with a strong operating role in the infrastructure, at least to begin to set the table so that we can model the new design. This job is not going to be easy. We are living in very troubled times of disbelief, disunion, and I think, at least where I come from, deliberate disinvestment. Deliberate disinvestment. I even wonder whether mobility is even a desired outcome for some people, or whether a return to a feudal structure where things are in place may be the option that they have. But that is not acceptable, and we will put forward a different vision. So I don't get to preach very often, but I do have a quote from one of my favorite inspirations, Mother Mary Clare of the Sisters of the Love of God, an Anglican mystic. And she has a wonderful phrase that's buried in here. She said, "We must try to understand the meaning of the age in which we are called to bear witness. We must accept the fact that this is an age in which the cloth is being unwoven. It is therefore no good trying to patch what is coming apart. Rather, we must set up the loom on which coming generations may weave new cloth according to the pattern that God provides." I love this notion that says our job is not to patch what is coming apart. That is collusion with systems that oppress. Even though the compassionate thing may be to do some of that because people are in abject misery. But our forward work needs to be to build the loom on which a new pattern can be woven. One that is consistent with having people to be able to hone and deploy the gift gifts that they were created to enjoy and use by God. So I leave with Mother Mary Clare, an Anglican mystic, speaks to the United States, a little reverse revolution. I think if we can build that loom on which a new pattern can be woven, perhaps in 10 years, 20 years, perhaps beginning in St. Paul, this map can once again become this map.